Read that part about meeting Lou on the boat.
Okay. Let me see if I can find it here. You'd think I'd know my own book, wouldn't you? So talk amongst yourselves. Fate takes a hand. Okay. When I was 14, I had nothing but contempt for marriage. I remember one day in school when we were learning about the holy sacrament of matrimony, I said to the priest who was teaching us, I'm never getting married. I'll probably just live in sin with some older American man. The words just tumbled out of my mouth. I've no idea where they came from, but everyone was shocked. As a matter of fact, I'd never seen a happily married couple. At the time, I was angry with my mother who was expecting her 7th child and still living in misery with my father. I used to say to my younger brother, Sean, why in God's name didn't she leave him when she only had the 2 of us? Today, I think that even if divorce had been legal, she would have opted to stay with him. There's a kind of dance that couples do, even though it can be deadly. They get so used to it that it becomes easier to continue than to quit. It's like the old adage, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. After my 7 years of wandering in the wilderness, well, you have to read my book to find out about the 7 years wandering in the wilderness. I had pretty much made up my mind to live my life alone. I'd had too many bad experiences with men and relationships. When I was in my mid-20s, I had this strong urge to have a child, and when the opportunity presented itself, I did so with a man of my choosing, with no commitment and no strings attached. The birth of my daughter, Ashling, turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. Having to take care of another human being will wake you up in a hurry. There's nothing like it. I took a long inventory of my life and saw all the things I needed to change. I had to stop blaming my parents for everything and take responsibility for my own life. Shortly afterwards, fate took a hand and threw me together with that older American man I had prophesied when I was 14. I was living in Canada at the time, and my daughter, Ashling, was still an infant. I had a fascination with Alexandria, the home of Cleopatra and the Alexandria Lighthouse, and one of the greatest libraries the world had ever known. I'd read Lawrence Durrell's The Alexandria Quartet, and on a whim decided to make a trip there. I was working in the travel business, so it wasn't such a far-fetched plan. My boss gave me the time off. I dropped my daughter in Dublin with my mother, and I spent a month traveling around Egypt. I loved Alexandria so much that I decided to move there as soon as I could organize it. 2 months later, I booked the trip at a quarter of the minimum fare, and then I quit my job in Vancouver, where I was working at the time, to go live in Egypt. With my year-old daughter, I boarded the P&O's Oriana for a 3-week voyage along the west coast of America through the Panama Canal to Europe. It was a beautiful spring day when we sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge and docked in San Francisco to pick up passengers and supplies. This was my first time in California. Somewhere near the Panama Canal, a couple from England introduced me to a fellow passenger named Lou, whom they thought I might like. He was a long-haired San Francisco radical, and we sat on the deck in the moonlight drinking champagne and Guinness and talking. A steward named Morris, well, he called himself Maurice, from Cork, took care of Ashling that evening and many other evenings. A lovely guy. Thank you, Morris, wherever you are. When Lou first heard my name, he said it sounded very familiar, and we racked our brains trying to figure out how he could possibly know me. I'd never been to San Francisco before. Finally, the penny dropped. 2 years earlier, I had been on one of my relocations by ship and had lost my steamer trunk with everything I owned in the world. My Nina Simone and Leonard Cohen records, a copy of Shakespeare's Hamlet, a pair of Waterford crystal goblets, and my treasured over-the-knee purple suede boots. Somewhere along my route, there had been a labor dispute on the docks, and my trunk got left behind. It ended up in Lou's locker at Pier 35 in San Francisco. where he was the baggage master. He'd had it there for 6 weeks while he tried to locate Renee Jackson, the name on the label. He told me that every morning he came to work, the first thing he looked at was a forwarding address for that trunk. The first thing he looked for. Eventually the P&O traced it, and it later caught up with me in Dublin via Fort Lauderdale and Le Havre. I asked Lou if he believed in fate. No, he said our experience with the lost luggage was merely a coincidence. Our moonlight talks continued over several nights. We were different in many ways, but our basic beliefs were the same, and we began to develop great respect and admiration for one another. I found out a lot about Lou and discovered that he did more than just talk about his beliefs, he lived them. Lou had gone to Delano every weekend and marched in the grape boycotts with Cesar Chavez. In San Francisco, he was at the sit-ins at the Palace Hotel and the car dealerships on Van Ness Avenue fighting to have those places integrated. He was a founding member of Men for Peace and put together the first anti-Vietnam War rally in San Francisco that was not organized by students. He was very involved in the trade union movement and also a great lover of the arts. A child of the Great Depression from a small town in New Mexico, he knew what it was like to be poor. His childhood experiences were not that different from those of a girl from the slums of Dublin. He lived through the blacklist of the McCarthy era and was almost lynched once at the GM auto plant in Van Nuys, California, for his union activity there. And we discovered that he knew many of the people who had been my friends in the Paris days when I lived in Paris. Lou told me he was interested in learning something about his ancestry. He had a few loose bits of information. His grandfather had left Ireland in the late 1800s and made his way to the mines of Montana. Once there, he had married a woman from the Blackfeet tribe, and together they had 13 children. He didn't have much more information than that. He wasn't searching for his roots, as they say. He was merely curious. When we got to Dublin, he rented a mini miner, and I offered to accompany him on his travels to show him the splendors of the place. Unfortunately for him, he had expectations of meeting a Kevin Barry or a Patrick Kavanagh in every town. In other words, he thought every Irish person would be a revolutionary or a poet or both. And we met nary a poet on any bar stool between MacDaid's in Dublin and the Plaid Shawl in Galway. There were oodles of raconteurs and fiddlers, but not an ounce of revolutionary thought amongst them. Where are all the revolutionaries, he wanted to know, and I couldn't answer him. In spite of that, he was having a great time. Since we couldn't find many people with whom to have fiery political discourse, Lou settled for solitary fly fishing instead. For days he fished without a nibble. One day out by a wild lake, we were enjoying the scenery and the fresh air when an old woman came walking towards us across the fields. I knew she'd been watching us all day from afar. "Would you like to have a soft-boiled egg and a bit of brown bread?" she asked. We said we'd love to, and she led us back across the fields to her thatched cottage. With the fire in the hearth and a kettle on the boil, it was like a scene out of one of J.M. Singh's plays. The woman made tea to go with her homemade brown bread and the fresh eggs. And when we were getting ready to leave, she pulled my companion aside and asked him, would he like to make a small donation towards the tea? Well, it's very interesting because I was so embarrassed and mortified, but he had the perfect answer to it. It really got me to get my head on straight and put things into perspective, because he said, isn't she a poor old woman and she's sharing her food with us? Of course we should help her. Of course we should make a contribution. So that, I learned something that day. After our fly fishing adventures, we took a small boat out to an island off the south coast. There were no commercial establishments there, but we were told to inquire at a cottage near the top of the cliffs. If she likes you, she'll rent you her caravan for the night, someone told us. I hiked up in my high heels, and one of the heels broke off. I always hiked in high heels, by the way. We knocked on the cottage door, and a woman answered. Her husband stood beside her. "Ah, you've nearly ruined your shoes," he said when he saw the shoe in my hand. He went and got a hammer and a nail, and he fixed it for me. His wife was more interested in whether or not my companion and I were married. We both gave different answers at the same time, but she pretended to be deaf. She launched into a moral tale anyway, but she rented us the caravan in any event. It was a magical setting on a lake with craggy cliffs a stone's throw away. The rocks were home to thousands of gannets and puffins, and we walked the island and did some bird watching. At Grogan's pub, now this was down in the southwest of Ireland, I mean off the coast of the south of Ireland, so when we got back to Dublin, we went into Grogan's pub, which is a well-known and famous pub in the middle of town. So at Grogan's pub in Dublin a few days later, news had already reached the city that I was travelling with a man and we were posing as a married couple. Can you believe that? It was already the talk of the town. My friend thought that was charming while I tried to figure out what spy organisation was tailing me. I was paranoid rather than charmed. I got to know my travelling partner very well during our 6 weeks together on the ship and in Ireland. He invited me to spend some time with them in San Francisco, and I did. I never did start a life in Alexandria. On our subsequent visits back to Ireland, I wore a wedding ring and we were able to share a room. Unlike that first trip when a woman at a B&B in Dublin told us, "I don't allow men to have female visitors. My husband patrols the premises at night, so don't try and pull any funny stuff." Ireland. We love her and we hate her, but she never leaves us. So I'll leave you.
37 years.
I'll leave you with the song, and then I'll take if you want to ask me any questions. Of all the money that ever I had, I spent it in good company. And of all the harm that ever I done, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for the want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night, and joy be with you all. If I had money enough to spend, and leisure time to sit a while, there is a fair maid in this town, who surely has my heart beguiled. Her rosy cheeks, her ruby lips, I own she has my heart enthrall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night, and joy be with you all. Of all the comrades that ever I had, they are sorry at my going away. And of all the sweethearts that ever I had, they would wish me one more day to stay. And should it fall unto my lot that I should rise and you should not, I gently rise and I softly call, good night, and joy be with you all.